Welcome to Wahsa Citizens Education Center's radio Zoom class. This is SVN3E, grade 11 workplace science, and I am Bronwyn Slate. If you'd like to participate live today, you are welcome to call the Wahsa studio at 1-800-465-7144 or 737-4017. You can call the radio, not radio, you can listen on the radio at 91.9 FM or on the television at Bell Express View channel 972. You're always welcome to join me through the live Zoom link, which is available from your teacher and also your DEC. Our classes are scheduled on Monday through Thursday from 3 till 4 in the afternoon, and we are wrapping up our second week of our course. A reminder of what work to submit for marking once you're ready. The key questions, the ones marked with the key icons, are the ones to submit for marking. So these are listed at the end of each of your IL lesson in the package that we have sent you. So it's not necessarily all of the pages in your, or all of the questions in your workbook. So make sure that you check in on the IL package book to see what questions are assigned for each lesson. So do all of them. They could be check your understandings from inside the chapter, or they could be activities or review questions at the end. Show all of your work and explain all of your steps in your thinking so that I truly get an understanding of what your thoughts are. Don't just give me one-word answers, give me full sentences and full complete ideas so that I can truly understand what it is that you are understanding. Also, make sure you're actually answering the question that is being asked. It is common for students to assume that they are on track, but that they're not actually answering the question that is being asked. So if you're unsure what the question is asking, please get in touch and we can clarify that together. We can figure that out, but make sure you're answering the question, confirming that you know what the question is asking first. You are welcome to do your work either by hand or electronically. You can write in your workbook, that is fine, and then scan or take a picture of it and send it to me. Or you can just write it out on a separate piece of paper if that feels better for you. There isn't a lot of space in your in the workbook, so it makes sense that you might need to use something else. You could also write it up, type it up electronically, either in Word or Google Doc. Both those files are really easy for me to access. Everyone has access to Google Docs through your NNEC email address. If you need help accessing that, you can let me know. If you're going to use a different program, that's probably fine, but if you could just touch base with me first so we can figure out to make sure that I can actually access them when you send in your work. I don't want you to do a bunch of work in a file that I then can't open. I just want to confirm that we can open those before you do that. So then there are 3 ways that you can actually submit your work for marking. The first method is to scan and send your work in electronically. If you write it out by hand, scan it in using a smartphone is fairly easy. You could use the iPhone Notes app or the Android Google Drive app. They're both fairly straightforward. If you need help with that, feel free to reach out and I will support you. You can also just take a picture, as I said. It just means that the file will be a little bit larger and possibly take a little bit more to send. So scanning it can be a little bit easier, but if actually scanning it, figuring that out with the applications is not accessible, then you can take a picture, that's fine too. Then you can send it, or if you're typing up your work, you can send it through email to studentwork@nnec.on.ca and CC it to be bronwyn.slate@nnec.on.ca, or you can send it to me through Facebook Messenger at @vslatewahsa. The second method is to drop your work off in Sioux Lookout. We have an outdoor mailbox at our location, 74 Front Street. We are the big red building next to the post office, and we have a small white mailbox next to our side door. So you can just put it in there. We currently aren't open to the public, so doesn't matter what hours of the day, anytime, just drop it off in that mailbox if you're in town, and I will get it to you and get it back to you as soon as I can. Third method is to hand your work into your DEC. Your DEC can either send your work through the Express or fax it to 807-737-1732 or toll-free fax to 1-800-463-7852. If you'd like to connect with me through social media, my Facebook and my YouTube are both under the name of Wahsa. So you can friend me on Facebook and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and then you'll get notifications every time that I upload a new video. We record all of our lessons, and after airing, I upload them. Usually the next workday is when I can do that. So then they're all there and you can access them whenever you want and slow things down, pause things, come back to stuff. It's a great way to access the information, and it's all there on YouTube under my YouTube channel under a playlist called SVN3E. And then within that playlist, there's two parts. There's all of our lessons, which are the recordings of all of our lessons. And then there's also a supplementary videos file or list that shows I've linked all of the ones that all of the videos that I've linked to that we've watched in class are there too. So you can just watch those videos if you'd like to. Science is really visual. I believe that learning is really visual. So listening to just me talk is one thing, but being able to connect with those videos and the visuals, the images that I put up on the screen are really going to set you up for the most success. So if you're able to, I strongly encourage you to either join me live through the Zoom link or connect on YouTube and check out the videos there so that you are able to get the full experience of learning. It's going to set you up for the most success of understanding. If you don't have access to reliable internet, let me know and I can send you a recording of the videos so that you still have access to them. All right, if you have any questions or concerns, please reach out and contact me. This is what I'm here for. It's my role to support you. My email address is bronwyn.slate, which is spelled BRONWYN.SLATE@nnec.on.ca. My Facebook is bslatewahsa. My phone number at the office is 807-737-1488. Sorry, I'm just having some internet issues. Let me get back to sharing my screen. If you do call me and leave a message for me on my voicemail, I might not have access to it. So if I don't return your call, then call me again or send me a Facebook or an email message just so that follow up. It's not that I'm ignoring you, it's just that I'm having some issues with my voicemail. You can also call us toll free at 1-800-667-3703. And my office hours are Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So that's the best time to reach me. If that doesn't work for you and you do need me to connect with you outside those hours, contact me and we can try to schedule something and figure out a plan to make it work when it works for you. Okay, before we dive into today's content, I just always like to position myself within the context of our course so that we're on the same page about where I am. I have white settler ancestry, so I have white privilege, and that guides the way that I look at the world and the way that I experience the world. So that also includes how I teach and how I understand learning. I am working to acknowledge that and work through that in order to benefit folks who do not have white privilege and acknowledge their experience and learning and their wisdoms. So that's part of what I bring as a teacher. I do live in Northwestern Ontario on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe people and honor those knowledges and knowledge keepers here on this land. I'm trying to learn from them, but that can be a challenge. So it's just part of my history and my story is working through the barriers of that and learning as much as I can in a respectful way. This is my first time teaching this course, so I have lots to learn and unlearn. It's a process and probably for as long as I teach this course, I will have new things to learn and unlearn, but I am working on that. Particularly with this being my first time, there is lots that is new, and I'm doing my best to acknowledge those things and integrate more experiences than just the white supremacist ideal, European ideal as the center of learning and science. Our textbook is also Eurocentric, so it also has, it's framed from a European white settler perspective, and that means that it may use some problematic language. I haven't read all of it, so I'm hopeful that it doesn't, but that may come up and it's something to note and that we can maybe improve upon in future use. It also, I have noticed already that it ignores Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis knowledges and experiences. And so that is problematic and concerning. I am attempting to integrate some of the knowledges and experiences within our course, within the lessons that I'm teaching, but I have a limited resource and knowledge on my own. So if there's anything that you recognize that I could improve upon, or you have suggestions or support, I welcome that as I continue to learn and access and improve as best as I can. All right, so today's lesson is what I call a Throwback Thursday lesson. So we are going to be going over our last 5 lessons, the last 2 weeks. We are finished. No, we're going to just be going over that material, lessons 1 through 5. So we're finished unit 1 and chapter 1, and we are partway through chapter 2. And so this is just sort of reconnecting of what we've done so far. But you may be asking, why are we reviewing already? We're just finished the 2nd week, and we haven't, we covered some material, but not a ton. So why are we doing this already? There has been research done, particularly referring to Hermann Ebbinghaus's research in 1885 when it started, about the forgetting curve is what he established. And this is the concept that we forget things really quickly. And so this graph on the screen is showing the forgetting curve here. So this is when we learn something, then right away we have 100% retention in theory. And then immediately over the course of days, one day we've already lost almost 20%. We're almost only retaining 80%. And by day 2, we're around 65% or so. And by day 3, we are below 60%. And by day 4, we're maybe 50%. And a week later, by day 7, we're already lost over 60% of what we were taught a week ago. So though it's only been 2 weeks, we probably have already forgot what we talked about a week ago, a significant amount of it. And so that happens really quickly, and that is concerning in terms of when you're trying to learn something new. However, continuation of this research was that if we come back to the topics, that means not only do we keep retention because we are revisiting it, so we're getting back the information that we have lost, the concepts that we've lost, the ideas that we've lost, we remember again because we've rediscussed them, but we also lose that information slower. So we don't have to review it as frequently over time. We review it frequently at the beginning, and it means that we are more likely to retain it for a longer period of time and not forget it as fast. So that's really beneficial. So with just reviewing every once in a while, then we're retaining, we're remembering because we're reviewing, but we're also holding on to that information for longer periods of time. So my plan is to consistently try to do some review on Thursdays as a Throwback Thursday sort of structure. And then we will keep bringing back the things that we've talked about at the beginning so that by the end of the course, we don't have to remember what we did 9 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago and have no idea. They're still fresh in our mind. As we learn more things, there'll be more things to review. So it's not like we'll be covering the exact same thing every week, but it just gives us a chance to retouch base to all of the things that we've talked about already so that we can remember them for the end when we're doing our culminating, and so that we actually retain the information from the course. So with that, we are going to start with the highlights. So we're going to go over the highlights of what we've covered so far. So with lesson 1, the highlights were, so this was the lesson on components of soil, water, and air. I'm not doing the highlights from the very first session that we did. That was just sort of an introduction to the course. We're just going to focus on the actual lesson highlights with the key questions and such. So with this lesson, we talked about soil, which we discovered were made up of air, water, minerals, and organic materials, and that the mineral composition of the soil, so the combination of sand, silt, clay, affects the porosity, so how well the soil holds water and nutrients. Then we looked at water, and we discovered that water is a universal solvent because it dissolves a lot of different chemical and molecular compositions. So we talked about how water is slightly polar, and so it dissolves a lot of things that are also slightly polar. Then we talked about the water cycle and how water flows through our system and is reused. And we talked about acids and bases and the pH scale and how that has an impact on the environment in terms of things that are more acidic or things that are more basic, and how that is important to acknowledge within our soil as well as our water. And then we talked about air, and that air is made up of various gases, particularly carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. And we talked a little bit about those cycles and how they are shared throughout the zero. So we had our 3 success criteria in terms of explaining the components of soil and impacts of porosity, explaining the water cycle and how acid and basic solutions work in our environments, and then how gases are made up of which other air is made up of what gases and the importance of them to all living things. Then next lesson was lesson 2, where it was the effects of human activity on soil, water, and air. So now that we understand what they are, we talked about the impacts of human activity. So with soil, we focused on the deforestation, urbanization, erosion, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and industrial chemicals that all destroy the soil. And so all of those things that we do are destroying and taking the nutrients away from soil. And then in water, we talked about how recreational, industrial, and everyday human activities pollute our water. And air, we talked about how the burning of fossil fuels leads to air pollution and greenhouse gas effect. And therefore, the climate crisis is a result in the detrimental effects on both humans and the natural world. And so because we are not taking care of our air, water, and soil, this is having an impact, and cycling through all of these things are interconnected. And therefore, we're noticing the impacts now about the climate crisis. Again, our success criteria are that you can explain the impacts of deforestation, urbanization, erosion, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and industrial chemicals on the soil. You can explain how humans have created water pollution, and you can explain how burning of fossil fuels has created the climate crisis and what the impacts are on both humans and the natural environment. Then we looked at lesson 3, and there we have the sampling and monitoring of quality over time. So this is how we know how we measure things for the soil, water, and air. So with soil, we talked about core soil testing, which is when you take a slice down the inside, like you kind of like a tube or something, that, or even with a trowel, you go down and you cut out soil so that you can see all of the different types of soil and the impacts on them under the crust. And we looked at soil profiles, which had the various horizon levels, O, A, B, C, and R or D. That's what we were looking at in terms of how we measure the quality of soil. With water, we talked about how water sampling is done. So again, putting a tube down into water and capping it, and then pulling the tube out and capturing the water. And then you're able to test it and not just get the surface, but also what is going on onto deeper levels. There are multiple ways that we do this in terms of like you can do a shallower testing is also a deeper testing depending on where you're testing. And that will get you different information about what's going on in the lake, river, or ocean body of water. And we talked about boil advisories and where they are in Canada and the impact, so that when we test the water and we sample it and then test it and we know that there are bacteria or pollutants in the water, the effects that has directly on humans in the water that we are consuming or using, and how most of those advisories, most of the places in Canada where people are impacted by unclean water are in First Nation communities, and how this is problematic and a product of colonization and oppression, and how we haven't figured that out yet. There have been recently actions that have moved to make that not be true anymore, and that First Nation communities are getting the support, the financial support and industrial support that they need, but that is still something that we need to improve upon. And then we talked about air and how stack sampling is how we measure air quality in terms of in industrial environments. So putting a probe into a smokestack and extracting a sample of the air from inside those smokestacks, and then that there's ways to test that in order to see what pollutants are actually being put into the air, and that's being regulated and checked consistently in order to decrease and regulate the toxins that we're putting into our air. And we talked about the air quality index and how you can find that, so you can see what your air quality is in your community, and how you might notice that and how you might be affected depending on that level of air quality. And again, we talked about the inequities of where that happens in the world in terms of our industries in North America, in Canada, and the United States. We don't have a lot of factories. We have some, definitely, but that a lot of our products are imported from other places, or the companies that are maybe located in North America, but the actual factories that create our products are in other places in the world, and therefore their air quality is affected while our air quality is not, and we are getting the products. So then, looking at our success criteria, we have that you could explain erosion and the lack of nutrients in soil due to human impacts. You can explain how water is sampled and tested for pollutants, specifically in drinking water. And you can explain how the air is tested and what contaminants are looked for in a sample and what that means. Then lesson 4, we did the cycling of, so that was the end of unit 1 and our chapter 1. And now we're moving on to lesson 4 moves on to chapter 2. So here we're starting talking about ecosystems and the cycling of substances within ecosystems. We talked about the non-living elements briefly of an ecosystem. So that are things like the soil, the water, the air are all part of the non-living elements of an ecosystem. That's how it's connected. But also like temperature, climate, precipitation would all be together. So those are all have an impact on ecosystems. It's not just the living things. And then we talked about specifically, we focus on the living things, and those are the producers, consumers, and decomposers. So producers are plants either on land or in the water, generally, who are able to get their food and what they need to grow from the air, the sun, and the environment around them. Consumers are animals and some plants that eat producers, that consume producers in order to grow and thrive. And therefore, there's sort of a secondary level. And there's multiple levels of consumers where not just, we don't all directly eat producers, but some eat other consumers that have eaten producers. And so that there's multiple levels of how that works. And then finally, the decomposers are after plants and animals, the producers and the consumers die, and then they decompose by the bacteria and fungi and scavenger animals and things like that, so that we break down the bodies and of producers and consumers, and then return back into soil and back into release those nutrients back into our system so that they can be reused by producers and consumers. So that cycle within a healthy ecosystem is all self-sustaining. So it means that there's enough producers, enough consumers, enough decomposers to deal with all of those levels, and nothing is over. There's not too much for anyone to work with. And we talked about the interconnected cycles, so of oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So those are what are being cycled through by the producers, consumers, and decomposers, and what each of us need and how we get those from the other ones. Those cycles show how they're interconnected. And then finally, we talked about biosolids. So in terms of human activity, humans also could be organized in terms of producers, consumers, and decomposers, but mostly we are consumers, and we don't have a very good decomposing element. We don't have a way of dealing with our waste. Most of our waste is non-biodegradable, and therefore just ends up being pollutants and toxins in our environment. So biosolids was where we focused on. We looked at one example. There are other things that we need to deal with, but we just talked about biosolids to just sort of introduce us to the ideas of how to improve decomposers in our own system. And they are, it's how human waste is treated and turned into a fertilizer that can then be used to rejuvenate soils where erosion and nutrients have been stripped. And then also they can be used in farms in terms of helping with as a fertilizer and helping for plants to grow. So there are helpful ways, which is really great in terms of a sustainable way to use a waste that is just going to be dumped into landfills or oceans or burnt and release more carbon into our environment. So those could be really negative ways of dealing with biosolids, but instead using them as a fertilizer gives some really good benefits. However, there were concerns we talked a little bit about in terms of heavy metals or pharmaceuticals like drugs and things like that in our biosolids, and what are the impacts of that on our soil and also on our food, so that we don't just want to barrel into it, this idea of using biosolids a ton, because we're still learning about it and we want to test them and be really careful about it. So our success criteria for this lesson were that you can make examples of producers, consumers, and decomposers for both natural and human ecosystems, that you can explain the negative impacts of human activities on ecosystems, and that you can explain the steps humans are taking to manage our impacts in more sustainable ways. And then finally, we had lesson 5, where we talked about carbon footprints. So carbon footprints measure the amount of greenhouse gases emissions produced. And we had an opportunity to do a personal reflection where you could look at your own carbon footprint. We went through, there was the one, sorry, my brain is just blanking, the one website where you can go through and you can actually calculate your own carbon footprint, which we've watched me do it. And we could see that it took, if everyone were to consume like I consume, it would take 3.5 Earths or something like that to survive, which obviously isn't sustainable. I don't live in a sustainable way as a person, a fairly privileged person in Canada. And though I do definitely take steps to have a smaller carbon footprint, they're just in terms of how our world is structured, there is only so much that I can do. So you could also do that personal reflection as well. Then we looked at the inequities of climate justice, or the climate crisis, and how the white minority in our world, whether it is in Europe or in Canada, US, or in Australia, white minority have created the most emissions and continue to create the most emissions, but historically as well. So this is something that has been a longer term thing, that though there are places in the world that are part of the global majority that are creating emissions historically and continued, the white minority are creating the most emissions. The richest 1% are creating more emissions than, or double the emissions as the poorest 50% of our world. So that's an issue in terms of inequity. Yet the global majority are the people who are going to be most impacted. So that is really concerning, because the people who are bearing the burden of this privileged life are those who are not engaging in the privileged life. And so there are not consequences for the folks who are creating this problem aren't being seen, yet everyone else is experiencing the consequences. And that's really problematic and something that's concerning. So we talked about reducing our carbon footprints and how there are individual impacts, individual things that we can do, but that we also need structural change. And we weren't able to watch the entire structural change, the debate between these two things. And if we have time today, we may be able to get to that video, but it is connected on the previous, on lesson 5's lesson show notes. You can find it there. You can link to it if you'd like to. So that it isn't just about turning off the lights or in your house, or reusing cloth bags instead of buying plastic bags. Those are totally good, important things, but it's also about how building our societies in ways that we don't need to be flying a lot, or ways that we don't need to be driving a lot. With COVID-19, a lot of people working from home and not just driving into offices to work in cubicles has reduced pollution significantly and made it so that folks in communities have noticed a really big difference. So that's more of a structural issue opposed to an individualized issue. And therefore governments and corporations need to be making those changes, because that's something that they can do on a larger scale, opposed to just individuals deciding to work from home if they can. That's not something that most of us can just decide to do, as one example. So the success criteria for this lesson were that you can define carbon footprints and explain who has the greatest impacts. You can explain climate injustices, and you can explain how carbon footprints can be reduced. So that's the material that we've covered so far. And now we are going to connect it. We're going to go through the key questions and just sort of talk about them. I'm not going to write out the question, the answers in terms of giving you the answers. I'm not into that, but we're just going to read through the questions and discuss them a little bit. If anybody wanted to call in, they could, and we could discuss about what the questions are and where you might be able to find that information. This is in chronological order, so going from the beginning, from Unit 1 up to Unit 5, and we'll go from there. So key questions on page 6 are check your understanding. This is from lesson 1. So numbers 1 to 3. So number 1, why is porosity important to having good soil? So remember, porosity is when you, how much space is between your grains in your soil and between the combination of silt, sand, and clay. And if you have too much of one, you're not going to have, either your soil is going to be too wet and hold moisture too much, and therefore that extracts the nutrients and makes it hard for plants to grow. But if you have too much space between it's too sandy, you have too much space between your grains of soil, then the water just rushes through and doesn't stay, and either it takes nutrients with it or just goes through, and then that means that that's not good for plants either. So you need sort of a balance. Different plants need different things always, but you need a bit of a balance in order to have ideal soil. Then number 2 is explain why water is considered a universal solvent. So this we talked briefly about in terms of how water dissolves. Because water is a polar solution, it dissolves most other polar solutions, because the molecules have a positive and a negative end and are able to pull away positive and negative ends from other atoms from other solutions. And so that means that it dissolves a lot of things. It does not dissolve everything, but it dissolves a lot of things. And then describe the difference between groundwater and surface water. I'm going to leave that to you, because I don't know how to say it in a way that doesn't just mean that you can copy what I say. Then key question number on page 7, this is still in lesson 1, where you check your understanding questions 1 and 2. So number 1, living things need oxygen to live. When humans breathe air, are they mostly breathing in oxygen? So if you think back to the chemical makeup of air, and we found out that 78% of the air is nitrogen. So we are not actually breathing in all of oxygen. We can't use the nitrogen. So it's not really beneficial to us, but that only a smaller, I think it was like 20%, but I could be remembering that wrong. Anyway, you can look that up to answer the question properly. It's actually just oxygen. And number 2, how do living things take in the nitrogen required for survival? So we need nitrogen, but we can't get it from the air. So this relates back to what we talk about later in terms of producers and consumers, is that producers are able to take it out of the air and use it, and that becomes part of their makeup. And then consumers are able to, then we consume producers and are able to get the nitrogen, extract the nitrogen from them, and which is the nitrogen that we need. So you can connect, if you've just answered these questions and you haven't done the other lessons yet, that's totally fine. You don't have to connect it to the further ones, but if you have done more and are going back to do questions, you can connect it to other parts in our lessons as well. That's also fine. And so then now we have the review questions on page 9. So I'm just going to quickly skim over them. I'm not going to go through all 12 of them, just so that we can touch base on the other lessons as well. But there's also there's not a ton of space. So I would expect that you're probably going to be using another page. Instead of just writing on this piece of paper, you have to be pretty cramped to write everything in on the lines that are given. You can, if you want to, but you just want to make sure that your information is clear so that I can truly understand it. Also, when you're drawing a pie chart here for number 4, it does not need to be perfect exactly. You don't need to get a protractor out and measure your angles. Its approximation is totally fine. You don't, just so you know that. Okay, so lesson 2, key questions on page 12. The check your understanding questions 1 through 4. What percentage of Earth's land is available for growing crops? I don't remember that off the top of my head, but I'm not going to tell you anyway, because that's just something you need to look up. That's not conceptual. That's just an understanding. Literally look it up in terms of my lesson or in terms of the in your book. And then number 2, using figure 1.11, determine what percentage of agricultural land is used for forest and woodland. Again, that's just looking up information. Number 3, describe an action that could occur at school or home that could potentially lead to water pollution. So this we talked about in terms of how all of our water is connected. And so dumping something down the drain, adding something to your water is going to have an impact on the other water in your area. So if you are not disposing of, say, paint thinner or oil or gasoline or something properly, then that's going to have an impact on your water in your community. And then using figure 1.16, describe the pathway for fertilizer to get to your ocean. Again, that's just looking at a figure and explaining step by step. So I'm not going to talk about that one. Then we have key questions on page 12. Check your understanding 1 through 4. This is the same thing. I'm not sure why I have it twice, but I guess I need, oh no, it's not. What it is, I don't know. Anyway, an error for my part. So the key questions on page 17 are the review questions for lesson 2. I feel like I must have missed a page and I just did the page 12 twice. Sorry about that. So here again, we are looking at ways that human activities are damaging topsoil, which we talked about both in our lesson and you can read about in your book. Talking about here, number 2 says many corn farmers leave the stalks of corn in the ground after the corn has been harvested. Give a reason why this is a good method of helping to conserve topsoil. So there you could talk about in terms of erosion or in terms of adding nutrients, like decomposing of things back into the land. Then what's the difference between water and wind erosion? Again, we can look that up. And I think it's fine balance between wanting to make sure we go through things, but also wanting to cover all 5 of our levels. So we're going to keep going. Yeah. Okay, key question number 19. So this is on page 19 for lesson 3. Check your understandings 1 to 3. What is a soil horizon? So this is going to be where we were looking at soil profiles. We had our horizons of O, A, B, C, and R, or D, depending on where you look at. And then number 2, describe the difference between the A horizon and the B horizon soil. So that is in your workbook in this unit, or also we talked about it, and I had some graphics that I showed in our lesson. And then when a soil core sample is sent to a lab for analysis, what components of the soil are tested? So that, again, is something to just look up in terms of what are we actually measuring for? Are we measuring for nitrogen? Are we measuring for sulfur? Are we measuring for bacteria? Are we measuring for plastics? What are we measuring for when we're looking at soil? Then on page 22, check your understanding 1 to 3. Number 1, how is water sample collected during a depth integrated sampling process? We watched a video about this where we watched people in a boat with a long tube, and they showed us the sampling process. Then when drinking water is tested, what is a microbiological test sampling for? So what kind of bacteria, what kind of pathogens are things that are we looking for to that we're sampling, that we're questioning about? And if water is turbid, describe what it looks like in a clear glass. So this we talked about briefly in terms of turbidity. Is the more turbid something is, the more cloudy it is, because it has more sediment or more things in it. On page 27 is your review questions 1 to 11. So again, I'm just doing a quick look through to see. So talking about, one is talking about soil samples and pH of soil. So you might need to go back into an earlier lesson to look at the pH scale. So yeah, there's a chart that talks about how to soil quality and what is telling you about a good soil and not good soil, a healthy soil. Number 5, why is a water sample is collected using depth integrated sampling process? Why is this sample called integrated? So integrated is like mixing. So it means that you're not looking for, when you do depth integrated sampling, you end up mixing the water. And so you're looking at it all combined instead of incomplete layers, because water doesn't exist in complete layers, though patterns do happen, but they're not like distinct, completely separated layers. So integrating it means that you're just getting a holistic view of the sample. Air quality index. What type of criteria do they use to inform the public of their results? So looking at the air quality index again, remember when we looked at this, the chart that is in your book is not accurate from what I can tell. I can't find anything that is connected to that, the scale that they have in your book. So I would strongly encourage you to use the ones that we talk about in our lesson, and if you search it, what you'll find online, because that seems to be more current, and I haven't found out why that information is in, like I can't find a time when it was changed or something, that's older information for a period of time. It just doesn't, nowhere else can I find that particular scale. So something to be concerned, just be aware of that when you're doing those questions. All right, so then for lesson 4, page 31, there was just check your understanding number 1. Identify 4 substances that cycle through an ecosystem. So we talked about that in our lesson. I'm not going to say exactly what those are because they're just listing off something. And on page 34, 1 and 2, what are 2 uses of biosolids, and describe 3 methods of disposing of biosolids. Again, this is talked about in your book, but also fairly detailed. We went over this in fairly detail in our lesson. And then we have your review questions on page 35, 1 through 6. So describe the difference in roles between a producer and a consumer. Hopefully between your booklet and our lessons, you can do that. Then describe how an ecosystem can recycle the waste produced by consumers and producers, so hand-to-hand decomposers. Number 3, in an ecosystem that contains farms, describe a human activity that could upset the cycling of substances through this ecosystem. We talked about that in our lesson in terms of what farms do that make it hard for producers, consumers, and decomposers to work healthily and have a positive, a good, healthy ecosystem. I describe one key difference between natural ecosystems and human activity systems. So we have we have producers, consumers, and decomposers, but in human ecosystems, our decomposers are not as effective as in natural systems. And then here on a separate sheet of paper, redraw figure 2.5 using examples from your own experience for a producer, consumer, and decomposer. So thinking about where in your life do you see places that are things that are being produced, things that are being consumed, and things that are being decomposed. And then what are 2 concerns about the use of biosolids? Again, we talked about that fairly extensively in our lesson. Okay, and then for 5, what is the difference? So page 37, check your understanding 1 and 2. What's the difference between a carbon sink and a carbon source? So remember, this is referring to forests. Forests can be talked about as carbon sinks, and because they absorb carbon, they take carbon dioxide in and store them. And then a carbon source is if those trees are burned or cut down, then that carbon source, the carbon gets released back into the atmosphere, and therefore they become a carbon source. And what does 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent represent? So we talked about carbon dioxide equivalents and how multiple greenhouse gases are in the air, but they don't all affect in the same way. And so there's a scientific calculation that makes everything in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents in order to measure and compare so that we're all talking about the same thing. Even if we're talking about different types of gas, we're talking about the same units of measurement. 38, check your understanding number 1. This is a personal reflection. So identify 3 activities that contribute to your primary carbon footprint and 3 activities that contribute to your secondary carbon footprint. So you need to know the difference between a primary carbon footprint and a secondary carbon footprint in terms of what you have direct impacts on and what you have indirect impacts on. On page 40, check your understanding number 1 to 2. What are 2 reasons a hybrid vehicle will have a lower carbon footprint than a vehicle with an internal combustion engine? That we talked a little bit kind of about that, not that specifically, but in terms of burning of fossil fuels, a hybrid vehicle would burn less of fossil fuels, and also in terms of how they're built. And then identify 3 activities that contribute to Canadians having a larger carbon footprint than Egyptians. I think they're just picking Egyptians in terms of someone from people from the global majority and compared to Canadians, which is sort of represented by the white minority, is my guess in terms of that, like wealthier and consumer, opposed to a country that is more producing and being affected by climate injustice. So that's something to look about into that a little bit further in terms of what is actually different. So then our review questions are on page 43, questions 1 through 12. And so talking again about why it's important to measure all sources of greenhouse gases emissions using the same unit. Why do we care? Why don't we just talk about nitrogen or sulfates or things like that? Why do we need to have all 1 unit? I would say to make things simpler. Talking about how understanding carbon footprints helps us understand the impacts of human activity on the production of greenhouse gases. So that, why is that a useful tool? We're talking about your primary carbon footprint and your secondary carbon footprint. They talk about using figure 2.9. So that might help you with when you're answering those other questions. Talking about a hybrid vehicle. I don't know why they asked that same question twice. So yeah, so more just the same, talking about what activities you can do personally to reduce your carbon footprint. This, and then here down at number 12, how can governments help to reduce the carbon footprint of their city, province, or country? So the same way, we have a little bit about the individually what we can do, but also structurally and socially, what can we do all together? I just remembered that I wanted to watch that video, but we don't have time because it's about 5 minutes and that's about what we have left. So that won't work for today. All right. If you have any questions and would like to touch base, please reach out to me. I'm always here to help and to go over things that we've talked about before. That's totally okay. That's what I'm here for. You can call me at the office at 807-737-1488 or toll free 1-800-667-3703. You connect with me through email at bronwyn.slate, which is spelled BRONWYN.SLATE@nnec.on.ca. You connect with me through Facebook at Slate Wahsa, and our lesson will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel at Slate Wahsa, probably within the next 24 hours or so. And my office hours are Monday through Friday, 9 till 4. So that's the best time to connect with me so that I can support you. If you have any questions, again, please always reach out, or just want to chat about something, please feel free to reach out. Thanks so much for joining me. Miigwech.